Welcome back to our channel where we break down aircraft crashes from a professional pilot and aviation crash attorney perspective. Today we're talking about 98 Kilo, an Epic 1000 which crashed on February 13th, 2026. Now before we discuss this crash, it's important to acknowledge that it was fatal. There were 4 passengers on board and all 4 passengers died. From the Ramos Law Aviation team and on behalf of myself and the rest of the Ramos Law team, we're deeply sorry to the friends, family members, and those who were affected by this tragic crash. For those that are new to the channel, who may not be familiar with me or my team, my name is Joe LaRusso. I'm the Director of Aviation here at Ramos Law. I wear 2 hats professionally. One is a professional pilot and the other is a crash attorney. Even though my team and I handle crashes throughout the country, we are in fact based in Colorado at the Rocky Mountain Metro, what I call Jeffco Airport, KBJC. Steamboat Springs Airport is a regular stop for me, both as a professional pilot and personally. My favorite air show to fly in was the Wild West Air Fest. That was one that we held open on the air show calendar every single year. And I was very, very sad when this town decided not to do it anymore. But very familiar going in and out of Steamboat on a regular basis. Now, as with all crashes, let's start with the facts. What do we know? And then what can we narrow down from that point? So this crash occurred just after midnight on February 13, 2026, middle of the night. The aircraft, 98 Kilo, was attempting to land at runway 32 at Steamboat Springs Airport that we call Steamboat Downtown. We know the aircraft departed from Kansas City Downtown Airport with the intentions of landing at Steamboat, so it wasn't a divert due to an aircraft issue. The aircraft impacted the Quarry Mountain, which is just south of runway 32, about 3 miles south. The METAR at the time of the crash was floating between 5 and 10 statute miles visibility, scatter clouds 500, broken 1600, overcast 2400, altimeter setting was 30.16. METAR show that the weather was declining throughout the night into the early morning. The aircraft is an Epic 1000. Since the crash, I've had a lot of people reach out to me asking about the experimental status of Epic. While it's true that Epic started life as an experimental aircraft, this one was certified. 98 Kilo was certified with an airworthiness date in March 2024. Now the actual design of the aircraft, the Epic 1000, was certified by the FAA in 2019. Its production certificate was issued in 2020. Personally, I remember back when Epic first hit the aircraft scene, and back then it was thought to be the experimental and cheaper alternative to the TBM. Now, it is equipped with a price of over $5 million, and it jumps right into the TBM market side by side, so more of an alternative than a replacement. The aircraft is powered by a Pratt & Whitney PT-6A, thought to be a bulletproof engine, giving it 1,200 shaft horsepower. It has a Garmin 1000 NXI avionics suite, complete with the GFC 700 Autopilot system, which includes Garmin auto throttles, and some of the newer models, depending on certification, have the option for the auto land, which we've seen in the news recently. Now, because it's a turboprop with a max gross weight of under 12,500 pounds, the aircraft does not meet the FAA requirement for a type rating. That being said, most insurance companies will require specialized training for each pilot. Now let's look at Steamboat. Steamboat Downtown has 3 approaches. They got the RNAV Zulu into runway 32. They got the RNAV Echo to no specific runway. The VORDME C, no specific runway. The runway itself is relatively short for a mountain airport with only 4,452 feet of service. It also has a displaced threshold because of Quarry Mountain. The displaced threshold creates an LDA of only 3,852. That's a landing distance of only 3,852. The field elevation very high, 6,882. Pretty standard for a high mountain Colorado airport. Now I can tell you from my experience growing up in Colorado and flying here my entire life, Steamboat Downtown's no joke. It's one of the hardest approaches in the Rocky Mountain region, and even a severe clear day, it is not super comfortable. There are little outs, what we call outs, if things go wrong. If you're on approach at 3-2, you can't bail out to the right or the east because of terrain. You can't go miss straight ahead because of terrain. To make matters worse, there's a small berm or a little hill on the left side of runway 32 right at the threshold, which typically produces swirling winds right at the time of your touchdown. So because of these issues, I almost exclusively bring jets to Hayden. Anything with a high weight, fast, high operating airplane, I'll take to Hayden. I keep Steamboat operations reserved or restricted to light piston on VFR days, severe clear days. With the aircraft in the airport set, let's move to the flight itself. Looking at the ADS-B track, it appears the aircraft was on autopilot the entire time. We see a normal descent from flight level 240, which is with consistent speed and a consistent descent rate. The descent continued all the way to Tilly, which is the initial approach for the RNAV GPS Zulu to runway 32, and then it continued from that point forward, which makes me believe that that was the approach used. Ultimately, it appears the aircraft maintained an autopilot descent until it impacted terrain. At the point of impact, the aircraft was about 140 knots. It was descending at approximately 1,000 feet per minute, which is pretty typical of an autopilot. Now, the Epic's VLO and VLE, landing gear operation and extension speeds, are both 150 on this airplane. So the speed is consistent for an airplane that's configuring for a final approach and setting up for a standard descent rate or a standard approach of 1,000 feet a minute. So with the autopilot on, the aircraft appearing to be properly configured, what could have possibly caused the CFIT, the controlled flight into terrain? Well, let's look closer at the approach plate. The first thing we see is the approach does not provide vertical guidance. We see it's an LNAV minimum only. That means there is no vertical or VNAV component, nor was this an LPV approach, which provides guidance similar to an ILS. The LNAV approach means that a pilot has to descend via step-down fixes to a minimum descent altitude rather to a decision height. What we call in the industry the dive and drive. Hitting each point, altitude, 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 stepping down like a staircase all the way down to the runway. Also, on the plate are notes. We see that circling northeast of the runway is not allowed due to terrain. That makes sense. We also see that the runway straight in minimums at night is not allowed, which is a super complex and confusing way of saying that this approach, the RNAV GPS Zulu, cannot be performed at night. Now, even though there is no vertical guidance provided by the approach itself, what's weird about this approach is the Garmin 1000 NXI suite attempts to fill that gap by producing imagined vertical guidance. The vertical guidance is not certified and is advisory only. Most importantly, it does not provide obstacle clearance or terrain clearance. So essentially what it's doing is it's putting an imaginary line, a 3-degree line, from the runway all the way up through the approach. And what is a little concerning in my view is the airplane can couple to it. So once the pilot acknowledges that the approach does not provide, it's not certified, they hit acknowledge. Now all of a sudden the airplane is allowed to couple to this approach and they can step down through the dive and drive fixes. And that line will continue all the way to the runway. Now if we look at the approach itself on the approach plate, we see very high minimums. The LNAV-MDA, again, not to be flown at night, so with the caveat as we discuss this plate that it should not have been flown at night. But the LNAV-MDA takes you down to 2,300 feet above the ground, 9,100, and we see a statute mile restriction of 1.25 miles. That is a very, very high minimum descent altitude for any approach. Most pilots will consider that very high. And the final the final altitude that it takes you down to, the MDA, is offset or pulled back from the runway 5 miles. And not only is it pulled back from the runway at 5 miles, but it's also offset 17.12 degrees. So when you hit that point, you have to see the runway, see the airport environment, and you have to correct the airplane to make a descent down to that runway. Now, touchdown altitude is obviously considerably lower than that, 2,300 feet lower than that. So not only do you have to correct the aircraft for the runway at the offset of 17.12, but now you have to dive that airplane down on a non-standard approach, non-standard angle to get to that runway, which is almost impossible in a very fast airplane, which is why, personally, in the jet world, I can't make that descent and still have a small enough speed or a slow enough speed to bring the aircraft comfortably to a stop. That's why I go to Hayden. So something to think about there is once you see it, you still got to get the airplane down to the runway. Interestingly enough here, where the aircraft hit at the mountain is 3 miles. So we're talking about the MDA and the runway being 5 miles apart. The mountain is 3 miles from the end of the runway, 2 miles offset from the MDA. Looking at the ADS-B track, it appears that the aircraft was coupled up to that GPS, or coupled up to that Garmin line, that imaginary descent line, and kept that descent slope all the way into the impact of the terrain. So we don't see what the approach plate intended was that level off there at the MDA, identify the runway, and then dive non-standard down to the runway. Rather, we see the airplane hooked up. So a couple things concerning about that is, one, obviously the capability of the Autopilot to hook up to a non-standard vertical descent line. I know that it's enunciated that is a non-standard approach and it must be acknowledged by the pilot in order to do the approach. However, still concerning that the airplane's allowed to couple to that and once acknowledged can fly that imaginary slope regardless of any terrain or anything like that. Another thing that's concerning is the TAWS, the terrain warning system on the aircraft, right? Certainly some indications going off in there saying terrain, terrain, terrain. It's interesting to note how those play together. And in an investigation, I would look at the interplay between the Garmin TAWS system and the Garmin approach system to see, is there an inhibit there? Is it automatically inhibited? Is it inhibited by the pilot? What's the relationship between those two features within the 1000 NXI suite? Where do we go from here? So the aircraft, we know, crashed on the mountain just prior to the field, 3 miles prior to the field. The NTSB and the FAA, as we've talked about in different in past videos, the NTSB and the FAA have two different roles when it comes to an investigation. The only entity that has congressional authority to investigate an aircraft crash in the United States is the NTSB. That power can be delegated to the FAA in certain circumstances, but in the case of a fatal, the NTSB will most commonly show up. And on this one, they definitely will show up because this is the first crash of a certified Epic 1000. So they definitely want to take a look at it. Now the FAA will show up as well, and they're going to run side-by-side investigations with the NTSB focusing on the aircraft itself, the components in the aircraft, the Garmin suite, the approach. They're going to look at all those things to determine how this CFIT, controlled flight into terrain, occurred. The FAA is going to look at something a little bit different. While they are going to come to a conclusion about their causation, they're also going to focus on the certification of the aircraft, and specifically the certification of 98 Fox Kilo. They're going to look at, was it properly maintained? Were all the databases updated? All that good stuff involving the certification of that specific aircraft and the airworthiness of that specific aircraft. Now they're also going to look at the pilot. They're going to look at whether he had a medical that was enforced at that time, whether it was good and proper. He's going to look at training. They're going to look at his training and see, even though he didn't need a type rating, did he receive the appropriate training for that aircraft? They're going to look at all the things that from a regulatory standpoint make this flight either legal or illegal. Now, once the NTSB is done with the scene, they're going to have the aircraft removed to a salvage center. Now, likely, the salvage area is going to be in Greeley, Colorado. And what's interesting about this one is there's a good chance that it's going to have to be helicoptered off that mountain. And it'll be removed to a flatbed. The aircraft will be pieced apart. It'll be put together on a lowboy, and then it'll be transported where it'll be stored indoors and available for additional viewing, right? Additional inspection. Now, the first inspection is going to be with the NTSB. It's definitely going to be with Epic, which is made here locally in the United States. Pratt & Whitney, I would imagine, is definitely going to show up, and I assume that Garmin is going to show up as well. And they're all going to be able to look at the aircraft and decide what parts need further investigation, what parts can they disregard as being not relevant to the crash. Of course, insurance is going to be there as well. There's likely going to be an insurance adjuster if the aircraft was insured, which we certainly hope it was. And at that point in time, the insurance adjuster is going to be the individual that is responsible or the owner of the aircraft at that point. Now, the NTSB is going to produce 2 documents in a very set timeline. The first document is going to be their prelim. It used to be 3. It used to be a prelim and a factual. The prelim and the factual are now 1 document. But the prelim is exactly that. It is a factual. It's just going to talk about the weather. It's going to talk about the aircraft. It's going to talk about the operation, this one being a Part 91 as opposed to a 135 charter. And that's essentially it. That's all that document's going to hold. Then, about realistically 2 years from now, we're going to get a final document. And the NTSB final is going to be their statement of causation. It's going to be a summation of their investigation up until that point. It's going to contain a docket. The docket is going to have every piece of information that they use to support their causation statement. So there's going to be pictures in there. There's going to be a witness statement in there. There's likely going to be an avionics evaluation in there, depending on the integrity of the 1000 during the salvage and the wreckage recovery. Now, when that report comes out, unfortunately, that report from a legal standpoint is not very useful to us from an evidentiary basis. In fact, under codified regulations, we cannot introduce that document as a basis for causation or negligence, which means if there is a law firm involved in this as well, what the law firm is going to have to do is start investigating the crash at the same time as the NTSB, at the same time as the FAA, and run a parallel investigation. The way that is done is when the NTSB is done with a component, right? If they're done with the wreckage, let's say, and they just wanted to keep those data cards from the G1000, they can release the wreckage to the insurance company, the owner, or to whoever, if there is no insurance company, would be the family. They can release the wreckage, and then they can work on the data that they want to work on and the investigation that they want to work on. And the release allows us to step in or another law firm to step in and investigate. And in this investigation, you're talking about putting an avionics specialist on this. You're talking about putting a flight path reconstructionist on this. It's definitely somebody who's familiar with the Epic aircraft, right? And its composites. We've talked a lot in past videos about metallurgy and how an aircraft breaks, looking specifically at the tear lines. In this case, the Epic's a composite aircraft, right? So we're looking at putting composite experts on there, trying to build a picture, recreate a picture of this crash. Now, of course, a big component of this, as we've talked about, is the Garmin interface with this, right? Now, the G1000 has data cards. The G1000 NXI has data cards that you can monitor the aircraft pretty tightly. And we're talking about airspeed, we're talking about altitude, we're talking about engine parameters, we're talking about what was entered in to the flight plan, right? Where the aircraft was heading to, what approach it was on, what it was coupled to. All that data is available through data cards in the 1000 NXI. It's just a matter of if that data is recoverable. So certainly, when the NTSB is done with that card, if the cards are intact, when the NTSB is done with that, that's going to be a very important part of this investigation, putting experts on those cards to try and recreate this accident and see what went wrong. Now, one component I haven't talked about till now that is something that I think is worth mentioning is the altimeter setting. So when you come down from up in the flight levels, where they were operating from Kansas City to Colorado, they're at a standard altimeter setting of 2992. Now, the altimeter setting at the Steamboat was 3016. So when you go from 2992 to 3016, you gain about 246 feet. So something to be said here of, was the altimeter setting appropriate? Now, the NXI, the 1000 NXI should what we call pimping. It should pimp the pilot and saying that the altimeter setting needs to be reset to the appropriate field elevation. And what it does is it flashes in yellow and lets the pilot know that the altimeter setting needs to change from standard barrel to the field elevation. So that's definitely something that's going to be looked at on those cards as well, is whether the altimeter setting was appropriate. Now, I've seen some fantastic videos put out about this crash, very factual. And I read the comments on those videos in addition to listening to them. And a lot of the comments are focusing on the fact that Garmin provides this vertical guidance with a warning saying it's not a certified approach. Almost letting Garmin off the hook, so to speak. Now, I can tell you, stepping back a little bit from the piloting standpoint, that unfortunately, regulatory guidance and approaches are written in blood. And what that phrase means is it takes people dying, getting hurt, for the FAA to look at regulations, for the FAA to look at approaches and say, is that going to work, right? Is this one worth it? And certainly this approach, the RNAV Zulu into runway 32, I would hope that at the end of this, the FAA is going to look at this approach and really question, one, whether they should have it at all, or two, whether maybe the MDA is not appropriate. right? Maybe that needs to be reset. Maybe the step downs are not appropriate. And really hammer into whether this approach should be done. I would say the same thing about Garmin. That stuff like this type of industry change is unfortunately written in blood. It takes something like this to look back and say, is that vertical guidance appropriate? Is the vertical guidance mixing with TAWS appropriate? Is what the NXI is doing from the point of the initial approach fix down to the runway all appropriate? And maybe it is, but it certainly should be looked at. And I don't think that we should dismiss it as quickly as I'm seeing in the comments and just turning immediately to the pilot. I think we need to look a little bit more at that human factors and a little bit more about what caused CFIT and a little bit more about Garmin's involvement and a little bit more about the FAA's involvement in this approach. Now, of course, this is all speculative at this point, and I acknowledge that. What we're here to do is not say, this is what happened. What we're here to do is say, what do we need to investigate, right? What areas can we look at, put experts on, and either run them to ground and say, nope, this is not it, move to another thing? That's what we're here to do, is to focus what type of experts we need, what type of area we should investigate on, and the NTSB and the FAA should be doing the same thing, although with a more limited budget and limited resources and limited staffing. Now, I've gotten this comment before in previous videos where they said, why don't you just wait till the NTSB comes out with their report so that we know what column of the investigation we need to run down? There's a big problem with that, and the big problem with that is statute of limitations. So we handle crash cases throughout the country, and each state has its own statute of limitations for events like these. Now, generally throughout the United States, the statute of limitations is 2 years. Think back to what I said about when the NTSB will produce their final report with their causation. It's about 2 years. Most of the time right now, due to staffing, due to budgets, and unfortunately due to the amount of accidents that we're seeing, the NTSB is running behind on that. So if we were to wait all the way for the NTSB to produce their report, more than likely, we'd be out of time to file a lawsuit. So we'd have the ability to investigate what they thought was important, but it would be for naught. It would be moot, because we wouldn't be able to legally act on anything that the NTSB found. So the side-by-side investigation is really, really important in crashes like these. And a 2-year timeline, to the NTSB's credit, is a very tight timeline to find all the data. There's certain places in the country that are the only places in the country that can evaluate certain data, and they're certainly running with a backlog. You run into a lot of difficulties like that when you're investigating a crash. So time is unbelievably of the essence to make sure that we're investigating early and we're investigating thoroughly. Now, as with every crash that we review, it's important again to remember that this was fatal. 4 people lost their lives. Families are turned upside down. Friends, loved ones are dealing with an unbelievable, tragic loss of life. So as you're reflecting on this accident, and as you're reflecting on the events that led to this accident, big call for you to be respectful. It's very easy to say, Part 91 pilot, flying at night, complicated approach, controlled flight in terrain, shouldn't have done that. It's very easy to say all those things, shooting from the hip. But I bet you there's more to the story. I bet you there's more of a human factors influence of, well, why was that coupled? Why did that hook up? What about the TAWS? Certainly a lot of things that go into this that may not be that quick, sudden shoot from the hip comment. So again, from the Ramos Law group, from the Ramos Law Aviation group, and certainly from myself, I'm so sorry to the family and the loved ones and the friends that are going through what they're going through right now. And I hope that you find what happened, and I hope that you find the cause, and I hope that you find understanding, and I hope that heals in the grieving process. So thank you very much for the time. Please feel free to comment below. We try our best to respond to all the comments, all the questions. Thank you for the feedback. I love the interaction. And thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next video.